Buttery, I've got your name correctly.
Yeah.
I didn't spell his name correctly to start with, which is wonderful. Is a very senior business clinician in Cambridge at the Addenbrooke, and he's going to talk to us about, hopefully, about DBS, I think, and what's the surrounding kind of attitude towards it. But he's the expert and I'm not, so I'm not going to witter on about it, and I'm going to hand over to Philip, who can talk to you sensibly about about the procedures and anything that's interesting.
Okay.
Okay.
So I need to share my screen, don't I?
Yes, thank you.
Share screen. That should work.
Oh, wonderful.
So you can see my Zoom page.
Yeah.
Can you see that?
Yes, yes.
Okay, brilliant. So, and can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So an introduction first of all. So I'm Phillip Buttery. I've been at Addenbrooke's for decades, but I mean I've been a consultant at Addenbrooke since 2006-ish, and I also work at King's Lynn and the Norfolk and Norwich. And I've been looking after patients with Parkinson's disease for years and years. And that's my area of specialist interest at Cambridge, where I help run the Deep Brain Stimulation service. So I'm not 100% sure what group I'm talking to, what mixture of people I'm talking to, but in this sort of a talk, there's often quite a broad range of understanding and interest. So I've taken a stab at a talk, but if you feel I'm going way over your heads or way under your heads, as it were, then please ask questions and I can go a bit more off-road, as it were, and try and pat back some questions if you have burning questions. Do interrupt at any point. As per Ruth's suggestion, I thought I'd talk a bit about Parkinson's disease and the role of deep brain stimulation, but make it slightly broader, sort of covering what Parkinson's disease is and where deep brain stimulation fits in. But I've tried to limit it to, well, sort of under 60 slides, as it were, so it doesn't become completely indigestible. But I'll start slowly and hopefully, if anyone has any burning questions, that should help out. So the question, what is Parkinson's, is so multifaceted. It's so many different questions wrapped into one that you could or I could spend 2 or 3 hours talking about it. So one has to try and divide up a bit and keep things simple. And one of the simplest ways of dividing it up is by looking at the history of Parkinson's, of which there's not a huge amount, to be honest, and the symptoms of Parkinson's and some of the science underlying Parkinson's. The biggest area by far there is the science underlying Parkinson's. It really is a vast array of science, which has expanded in the 20 years or so I've been a consultant enormously. And when I was doing my PhD back in 1994, it was a much more sort of well circumscribed area. But we'll touch on some of the science too. So I mean, historically, the Parkinson's is named Parkinson's because of the chap who first described it back in 1817. And he actually only had one publication. Nowadays, people have hundreds of publications. He only had one scientific publication, which was an essay called The Shaking Palsy, which described Parkinson's. And this is one of the sentences from it, which basically just describes the characteristic features of someone with Parkinson's. I mean, in retrospect, there are some people who claim there are descriptions of of Parkinson's dating back much longer, even back into some Egyptian scrolls and things. But that's all rather an intellectual game in some sense. Parkinson's disease became Parkinson's disease because it was named by James Parkinson in the 1800s. So what is Parkinson's today, sort of 200 years later? It's a very important disorder. It's very common. It affects 1 to 2% of the elderly in the UK. And in numbers, that means that there are probably upwards of 1,000 or maybe 2,000 people in Norfolk with it. And there are new cases at a rate of probably about, the calculation I made was about 9,000 per year in the UK. So it really is an important disease. And it's probably becoming more common or more prevalent as the population generally ages. And of course, there are numerous people who you may or may not recognize who have had Parkinson's or have Parkinson's, as you can see in this little montage here. Some of those people you may recognize, some of them you won't. But the question, what is Parkinson's? Really, as I said, it means the answer is different depending on who you are, whether you're a scientist or a clinician or a patient or a relative. The answer to that simple question is very diverse, and sometimes you have to step back a bit to try and get the whole picture. As neurologists, as medical students, we get taught what Parkinson's is from a textbook, and the 3 cardinal features that everyone mentions, the symptoms that people get, are tremor, which not everyone gets, rigidity, that's stiffness, and slowness, or what we call bradykinesia. So the diagnostic criteria, actually the cardinal one is the slowness, the bradykinesia, because not everyone has tremor, and stiffness can be rather difficult to measure. And the other aspects that sometimes get missed off is that people often have an impairment of balance, and that can certainly become more obvious the longer people have Parkinson's. And there are a lot of what we call non-movement or non-motor symptoms, which have a variety of origins, but they're very prevalent and probably in the past certainly have been under-recognized as in their importance. And they include things like pain, low mood, anxiety, constipation, and blood pressure problems, usually low blood pressure. But of course, medicine's a complicated thing, and neurology is a very, very complicated thing. And the bottom line is that neurologists get the diagnosis wrong now and again. And it's true that not everything that shakes, as it were, not everyone with tremor has Parkinson's disease, and not everyone with Parkinson's disease has tremor. So there are overlaps with Parkinson's in the diagnosis between other disorders, some of which people will have heard of and some of which people won't have heard of. So essential tremor is one of the more common ones that sometimes gets mistaken for Parkinson's. And there are a couple of conditions called progressive supranuclear palsy, PSP, and multiple system atrophy, MSA, which can certainly look a bit like Parkinson's, certainly early on after the diagnosis. What are the causes? This again starts to be a really big area. You may well have come across apparent causes of Parkinson's yourselves, and you're reading just of newspapers or listening on television. Lots and lots of things have been postulated or shown to be to contribute to the diagnosis, to someone developing Parkinson's at some time in their life. So the oldest causes out there are things like toxins and pesticides, and it's probably true that some of those can contribute in some people. And equally, there are some protective factors. For example, tea consumption has been postulated to be protective. There's some uncertainty about smoking because although it could be protective in some aspects, it's probably true that people who are developing Parkinson's might actually stop smoking before they become actually manifestly having Parkinson's. And then over the last 20 or 30 years, it's become increasingly obvious that genetic factors play a role, although formally inherited Parkinson's disease is really pretty rare, there are an increasing number of genetic factors that contribute to the likelihood of somebody developing Parkinson's. The other way of answering the question of what is Parkinson's is to turn to the chemical that everyone's heard of in Parkinson's, and that's dopamine. Dopamine is what we call a bioactive amine. They're present in all animals, vertebrates and non-vertebrates, and they have a role of what we term a neuromodulator, which basically means it modulates how nervous systems work. So even something as primitive as a crab has neuromodulators, which affect the way crab brains work. But in mammals, dopamine is one of the major neuromodulators, and it is dopamine that is gradually lost in people with Parkinson's. So that picture there, that sort of two headlights in the dark, on the left, that's the dopamine in a normal brain, and on the right is a dopamine in a brain of someone with Parkinson's. So the normal brain shows a pattern of dopamine that looks like two commas virtually touching each other, one on each side of the brain, and the tail of the comma is gradually lost in Parkinson's on both sides. Often in Parkinson's, there's a degree of asymmetry. Typically, symptoms start on one side, but sometimes it can be fairly equal one and the other. And this loss of dopamine also occurs in other conditions that aren't actually Parkinson's disease. So it can occur to a degree in multiple MSA and PSP, those two conditions I mentioned earlier. So that's one straightforward answer. Dopamine is lost, and the dopamine is lost because the dopamine cells in the brain are lost. So this is actually a picture of a couple of brains where you can see that the dopamine cells are actually black because they contain melanin, the skin pigment. And in the normal brain, there's plenty of melanin in a band in the right place in the brain, and that band is lost in Parkinson's as the dopamine cells are lost. So it's not just a loss of the chemical, it's a loss of the cells that make the chemical. And the chemical is important. If you do a figurative diagram, is my pointer working? Hopefully.
Yes, yes.
Dopamine is sort of ramifies, it spreads through the nervous system. So it spreads everywhere. And the main spread is to these areas in gray, which is the movement circuitry. So here on each side, the dopamine spreads from the bottom of the brain, and the wires, as it were, the projections spread around and sort of sprinkle the movement parts of the circuit, a bit like a sort of watering can, spreading dopamine over the important bits. And in Parkinson's, what happens is those dopamine cells are lost, and so you lose the watering can of dopamine to the movement circuits. And if you go back to that previous picture, you lose the dopamine in the scan. In fact, dopamine is more widely spread, so that all the cells in the brain receive dopamine to a certain extent, but by far the majority of it is sprinkled on the movement circuits, these bits in gray. So the question of what is Parkinson's, we can simplify and say it's a dopamine deficiency, and a lot of the symptoms that come from Parkinson's are symptoms of dopamine deficiency. And dopamine deficiency can cause symptoms, really, broadly speaking, in two ways. Firstly, the dopamine deficiency can affect circuits. And so here, what I've done is I've drawn out a circuit simply on the left here. This is a movement circuit. Those gray areas from the previous diagram are now in different colors. And the movement circuit it's a bit one of those old telephony circuits. The wires go from one gray area to another, and one area switches on another area, and the activity through the circuit is modulated. And what dopamine does is it allows the signals in this circuit to work properly. It's sprinkled all over there and makes the circuits happy, as it were. There, I put a watering can. So that's what dopamine's doing. It's just sort of sprinkling over the movement circuitry. But in Parkinson's, when there's no dopamine, the circuits now interact very differently. They send different signals to one another. I've put weaker green arrows here, but actually some of the signals are stronger. And in particular, one gray area, this place called the STN, gets much more active and seems to actually inhibit some of the other circuitry. So the STN sort of puts a brake on all the movement circuitry. Now, the second way that dopamine deficiency causes problems is that it spreads. And it spreads in two ways. Firstly, that the dopamine deficiency gets more extensive, and it seems actually to almost spread from the bottom of the brain further upwards. But also, the problem that is causing the dopamine deficiency spreads beyond the dopamine nerves. So it starts to affect dopamine-like nerves, and then it starts to affect all nerve cells, including the cells that affect the thinking. The degree to which that happens is extremely variable, so it's difficult to say absolutely. And the dopamine deficiency spreads because beyond the dopamine system, because actually what's happening is that there's a protein, some of you may have heard of this protein, called alpha-synuclein, which is doing the spreading. So alpha-synuclein is just one of tens of thousands of brain proteins, and it seems to be one that's particularly prone to aggregating, forming aggregates that do the cell some damage. So you can think of alpha-synuclein in this context as a bad protein. Obviously, it has important things that it does anyway, but pretty much in adults, it's not an important protein in a good way. It's an important protein when it starts to aggregate and misbehave. And when it aggregates, it forms these things called Lewy bodies, and that's one here. This pink bit, that's an aggregate of abnormal alpha-synuclein protein mixed in with other proteins, and you can see that in nerve cells in the brain. So these Lewy bodies, this bad alpha-synuclein spreads beyond dopamine nerve cells and causes wide problems that are more widespread than just the movement circuits. So to summarize, Parkinson's is to some extent two things. It's a circuit disease in which dopamine is the main problem, or lack of dopamine is the main problem. And it's a spreading disease where the dopamine changes have become extensive and spread beyond the dopamine system. The circuit disease problems causes the movement symptoms, the tremor, the slowness and the stiffness we mentioned up front. And the spreading disease causes the more difficult symptoms, particularly the walking difficulties, the balance, some of the thinking difficulties, and some of the emotional difficulties, and some of the other more complicated problems. So, where does deep brain stimulation fit in? So, on the left there is a patient in an operating theatre having an operation. On the right is a diagram of what we do to one half of the brain. And the electrode there is clearly drawn in, and it's put into that movement circuitry that we showed in one of the previous diagrams. And we find that if it's put in exactly the right place, and that's this STN nucleus, subthalamic nucleus, then what it does is it can actually jam the bad signals. It's sort of a bit like electrical jamming. It jams bad signals and it allows the movement circuitry to go back to a more normal pattern. So it really is an electrical trick. It's an electrical trick that effectively makes the brain think it's getting dopamine when it's not. So although it sounds clever, it's a trick. I suppose it is clever in that sense, but it was really picked up more by chance than anything else. The electrical lead in the brain is connected to wires that go behind the ear, under the skin, obviously, to something in the chest that's a bit like a cardiac pacemaker. So it's a small box, and they're getting smaller with newer technology, and they're getting rechargeable now. And that sits under the skin, and it produces about 3 volts of voltage, so not very much. And that tickles the brain enough to change the pattern of activity in the circuitry. So here are some more pictures of the way the surgeons can visualize it. I'm not a surgeon myself, so I don't do the operations, but the surgeons can visualize what they're doing in the brain using this sort of modern computer technology, which is very clever. And I can program the stimulator after the operation to produce a nice bubble of electrical charge, which disrupts the circuitry. And these are some of the devices we put in. You probably can't see how big they are there, but I think, yeah, there you go. So the current rechargeable one we're putting in here is really quite small, and it's quite snug. If we don't want a rechargeable one, you have to have a bigger version, which is this sort of size, which can last between 3 and 5 years. But a rechargeable one, in principle, if you charge it every week or two, can last up to 20 years. There are other companies as well. In fact, we use 3 different companies with slightly different technology. So that's just a brief run of what DBS is. DBS effectively helps the circuit problem in Parkinson's. So that's just shown here in these cartoons. So this is a normal diagram, as I said. This is the abnormal diagram when you lose dopamine and you get abnormal circuit activity. By sticking an electrode in and connecting it to a battery and stimulating it in the right way, you effectively jam this STN bit of the circuit, and that normalizes the rest of the circuit activity. So it looks now like the normal circuit, but the STN is sort of taken out of the picture. So DBS tricks the movement circuits into thinking they have dopamine. And effectively, it's doing the same thing as tablets, but it's like a 24/7 electrical tablet. And importantly, and this is a key statement, a couple of statements here, that DBS is only really useful if the tablets work. Now that sounds paradoxical, but when tablets work, they don't always work 24/7. So sometimes a patient will take a tablet and it'll only work for an hour or two. Sometimes they'll take one tablet and it works okay, and the next tablet they take, it doesn't work. So when the tablets start to become erratic, that's when we start to think about treatments, the deep brain stimulation as a treatment. It works like a 24/7 electrical tablet. Okay. Whereas the spreading form of the disease beyond dopamine, those sorts of symptoms, the walking problems, the balance, the thinking problems, those don't respond very well to tablets, and they don't respond very well to deep brain stimulation. They're simply too complicated for simple tricks like tablets and deep brain stimulation to help. So those are the 2 phases of Parkinson's. Circuit disease is present in everyone. It tends to be present at the beginning, but it becomes more difficult to manage with time, and that's when we move to think about deep brain stimulation. Spreading disease is often not very obvious at the beginning. It can take years or decades to come in, but when it does come in, it means that DBS is less likely to be helpful. Most patients have aspects of both of those things, but it's extremely variable how much. And DBS is most useful when the circuit disease dominates. So a sort of simple yes/no table is that we think about deep brain stimulation when patients are responding to tablets, but responding erratically. We do deep brain stimulation for tremor that's not responding to tablets. That's a slightly different aspect. But we don't think about deep brain stimulation if there are clear signs of spreading disease. And typically, there is no such thing as an average PD patient. Everyone is completely unique, I can promise you. But on average, if we collate our patients, we tend to do deep brain stimulation in patients who've had Parkinson's for at least 10 years, often 12 or 15 years. We will do it earlier if tremors become a big problem, and that can be the case in the first 5 or 6 years. And roughly speaking, we tend to do deep brain stimulation on those under 70. There's no absolute cutoff, but it seems that over 70 years old, the brain doesn't really take to deep brain stimulation quite so well. Some units across the country won't do it over age 65, but we try to be flexible and sort of judge each patient in the round. So summary, DBS is a good treatment for the right patient, but, and it really is a very big but, it doesn't help the slow progression of spreading disease, and the future treatments must really aim at treating that aspect. And that's where a lot of the research activity is ongoing at present. And that, as I say, is a very big topic. Our team in Cambridge is relatively small, but we sort of have a larger multidisciplinary team where we meet and talk about cases. You will have heard of some of these people. Mr. Morris is our neurosurgeon. Claire is our specialist nurse. And we work pretty closely with some other neurologists, including 2 academics, Professor Roger Barker and Dr. Caroline Williams-Gray, a couple of other NHS neurologists, Paul Worth and Wendy Phillips, and our team of specialist nurses and neuropsychologists. So that's a quick run through. If anyone has any particular questions here, now's probably a good time to speak up. And
Anybody's got a question? Thank you so much, Philip. Can I ask people who have a question to put their hand up so we can unmute you, and then you can ask Philip. Who wants to ask a question? I think Jeff Wade put his hand up first. Can you unmute him, Simon? 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 Oh.
Yeah, I'm unmute myself actually. My connection is quite poor, so I think people can unmute themselves if they want to.
Okay, can you unmute yourself, Jeff? Can you? Yeah, brilliant. On it.
I'd just like to say that's the most interesting introduction to Parkinson's I've ever heard. That's very good. It's excellent. I can see.
Thank you.
What is your success rate in?
Oh, that's a common question, I'd say. I mean, the trouble is with measuring success is that there are 101 different things you can measure. So in everyone, pretty much, you can measure some improvement in some aspects. The trouble is that Parkinson's is a progressive condition, and we're all human beings, and we're very aware of what the biggest problem is. So when patients come to clinic, when I go to clinic as a patient, I have a list of problems, 1, 2, 3, 4. And while deep brain stimulation can help some of those things on the list, people with Parkinson's often have other problems, those spreading disease problems that then rise to the top of the list. So in my patients who've had Parkinson's for say 15, 20 years, and they've had deep brain stimulation, say 5 or 10 years ago, a lot of them have problems with walking, and that is now by far their biggest complaint. And deep brain stimulation doesn't do anything for the walking. It's one of my repeated phrases. Deep brain stimulation pretty much doesn't help the walking if the tablets aren't helping the walking. But walking problems, as you can appreciate, can be the biggest problem for people after they've had Parkinson's for a few years, because it means you can't get around, or when you do try and get around, you fall over. It's very difficult.
Thank you. And I think this was Hillary. Hillary? Hillary, yes? Can you unmute yourself, Hillary, if you want to ask a question? Hillary, help. Oh, no. Yes. Ah, brilliant. What happened? No?
What happened?
Oh, clearly doesn't want to ask a question. Jane, you wanted to ask a question, or is that just your fingers in front of her?
No, I'm fine, thanks. No, very good talk though. Thank you, Philip.
I do believe Hillary or Bob. I think Rob, you put your hand up, I think. Yeah? No? Oh dear. Got some
No, I can see it. I can't read your lips.
I've got a question, Ruth.
Ah, brilliant. Thank you.
I've
Yes.
got a question. Is that
Go on.
low blood pressure
Yes.
is an indicator of whether you've got Parkinson's? Yes, is that so?
No, things are never that simple, I'm afraid. I wish it was. No. I mean, my mother doesn't have Parkinson's, but she's got low blood pressure. So, so nothing is ever quite that simple. People with many years of Parkinson's, say on average over 10 years of Parkinson's, are quite likely to have a low blood pressure, particularly when they stand up. The ability not to drop your blood pressure when you stand up is an amazing ability that most people have for most of their lives. You get out of bed, you stand up, and you don't faint. That's actually quite amazing. It's even more amazing if you're a giraffe. But the fact that you can stand up without fainting as a human being is amazing. But what happens in later stages of Parkinson's is that the mechanisms that hold up the blood pressure are actually run by chemicals that are quite similar to dopamine. One of them is called noradrenaline and one of them is called adrenaline. You've probably heard of those. But they hold up the blood pressure and they work via nerves that produce these amines like dopamine. And those nerves are also affected in Parkinson's. So although that dopamine scan showed loss of dopamine in the brain, if you could do a whole body scan for dopamine, you'd find that dopamine throughout the body was also reduced. And therefore the body is less good at holding up the blood pressure when you stand up. So you can be in an unfortunate situation where you stand up and you faint because you've got Parkinson's. But that doesn't mean that everyone who faints has Parkinson's.
No. It's like people that, when you complain of constipation for years, they say, well, half the population suffers from constipation, and you can't say they've all got Parkinson's.
That's right, yeah. But people with Parkinson's are very prone to constipation, more prone than average.
Yes. But I mean, it's interesting because I was diagnosed with low blood pressure because back in 1966, when I gave birth to twins, and this is before scans and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so they weren't discovered until quite late on, and when they decided to x-ray me for various reasons. And they couldn't understand why my blood pressure was so low. And so they said to me, you have an averagely low blood pressure. And that was manifested later on twice when I fell off a horse. And after about 5 hours later, I completely blacked out.
Yeah, no, I mean, out beyond my Parkinson's hat, I see lots of patients with lots of symptoms, and I see people who pass out because they have low blood pressure. And that doesn't mean I think they're going to develop Parkinson's later on. The other way around can certainly be true, but Parkinson's can have what we call a prodrome. So before the diagnosis is made, people can have symptoms that you think after the diagnosis is made, aha.
Yes.
And the one that's been in the news recently is what we call vivid dreams. So people with vivid dreams can later develop Parkinson's. They don't always, but they can do.
Well, certainly my late husband was one of those, because I mean, he used to wake me in the night by sort of shouting and screaming. Yeah. And this was years and years before he developed Well, in fact,
Yeah,
it wasn't a straightforward case, but part of his problem was Parkinson's.
yeah, and there's a lot of research going on around that at the moment.
Thank you, Margaret. Is there anyone else? Janet,
Strawberry has a question.
Strawberry. Sorry, I think Hilary was next. Hilary, yeah. Rob, you okay? Rob, are you ready now to ask a question? Or not? Yes, no? Clearly not. Janet. Janet?
Oh, right. As a former telecommunications network engineer, I've got two questions. Does the probe have more than one target? And secondly, I gather there are multiple terminals on the end of the probe. How are they used?
Oh, fantastic. I love telecommunications engineers. They always ask good questions. There is more than one target. And there's a little bit of difference between different units around the world as to which ones they prefer. Broadly speaking, there are 3 targets. The commonest one in Europe to be used is that thing called the STN that I mentioned. There is a target quite close to it called the GPI, which we use occasionally and which is a bit more popular. These things do have trends. It's a bit more popular in America, I gather. And we call it the gentler target. So the STN stimulation usually allows the patient to take about 50% less medication, sometimes even 100% less medication. Sometimes they can come off medication entirely.
Wow.
But the gentler target of the GPI is, I think, slightly less prone to some side effects, but is equally, you're not going to get the medication down very far. You'll reduce it by about 10%. But it can be still a very good, gentler way of doing almost the same thing. And finally, there's what we call a tremor target, which we actually don't use that often in Parkinson's. We use it for tremor. We do use it for people with Parkinson's who have really, really, really bad tremor. But usually tremor in Parkinson's responds to the conventional STN target. Then the second part of your question about the bits on the end of the probe, that's evolved over the years. In the olden days, sort of in the 1990s and 2000s, there were just what we call four or five contacts on the end. And we'd typically use those as one negative contact or one negative contact and one positive contact. Nowadays, the simpler probes have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different contacts, and some of them have many more, and there have been experimental ones that have dozens of contacts. And what that allows is you to slightly alter the exact bit of brain you're stimulating. The STN, the main target, is small. It's about the size of a large peanut. So you've got to aim for that from outside the skull, and you've got to hit it as accurately as you can. But 0.5 millimeter makes the difference. And so being able to slightly twist the electric field with the different contacts on the end of the probe can compensate for, as it were, slight mistargeting by a half to 1 millimeter or so. So that is quite useful, and it's come in my lifetime doing this, as it were. It's quite useful in reducing side effects, which can be things like tingling or slurring of the speech as a side effect of the stimulation. That probably answers most of your questions, but if you've got more, do ask.
Any more questions?
And the strength of the signal damage the brain?
What's that?
It probably could if you turned it up high enough. The manufacturers have limits on it. And also, it's only a 3-volt battery. It's not like you're plugging it into your car battery. It's a little tickling stimulus that can still produce quite a lot of side effects, but it's basically not at the level where it would burn the brain. Burning the brain is something that's actually done selectively for tremor in some patients. But that's a completely different procedure.
Can I just interrupt? There's a sign from Hilary, but I can't read it.
It says we are unmuted here. Are
Ah.
you unmuted?
You want? Do you want to ask a question? Difficult to tell. Clearly not. Okay. Well, I keep trying. Are there any more questions?
Yes, Janet has a question.
Okay, carry on.
Hello. Thank you very much for that talk. It was very, very helpful, and one of the most informative and clear presentations that I've heard in more than 15 years of being diagnosed with Parkinson's. Yeah, how long does it take to get the settings set correctly after DBS?
Oh, that's a really good question. I've had patients who we don't. Let me say to start with, we don't usually switch it on straight after the operation. We usually, with this thing about hospital beds nowadays, we get the patient in and send them home within 1 or 2 nights, and we bring them back to clinic to switch it on later. I have had one patient I particularly remember was this device was switched on in theatre, sort of not by mistake, but it was, you know, it was switched on in theatre just as a happenstance. And ever since then, I've not managed to change the settings at all, because everything I do makes things worse, and he's incredibly pleased with the setup. So there's that sort of situation. In other words, virtually no input from me except to monitor the battery and say when it needs replacing. And the other end of the scale, I have kept on twiddling with stimulators at 6, 9 months, 9 months, trying to get rid of really problematic problems. And very occasionally we have had to think, you know, maybe we actually need to replace one of the electrodes because it's not working quite well. It's not quite in the right place. But broadly speaking, on average, it probably takes 3 or 4 visits at sort of 2 weekly to 2 monthly intervals. So I would expect to be tuning it over a period of 3 or 4 months.
Right, thank you.
Right, how else? Anybody else wants to ask a question? Yes? No? If not, I'm going to say to Philip, thank you so much.
Jeff is waving.
Oh, Jeff's just got a question.
Yeah.
If someone had the DBS operation and it starts to lose its efficiency, do you then do a second operation?
Oh, that's a good question. No, we don't. I mean, there have been studies looking at deep brain stimulation, and the benefits tend to persist, particularly for tremor, but they tend over time to get slightly swamped by other things, like the walking in particular. Okay, that's so. But the operation for tremor tends to be the most satisfying in the sense that if it's a bad tremor and it goes away completely, that's really dramatic.
That's amazing.
And then when we switch the stimulator off, it comes back, and that's really dramatic. And you know, I've seen people who've had stimulators in for 20 years, and you can still see that effect switching the stimulator off and on. But in people who don't have tremor, the benefits are often slightly less obvious until the battery runs out inadvertently, and then everyone realizes how much they needed it. But as I say, the residual problems of the difficulties walking that creep on, they're not helped by the stimulator.
No. What I was going to say was, because we're all different, every one of us.
Everyone's different.
Yeah, and it's I just wondering how it affected.
So I missed that.
Oh, that's okay. I was just talking to myself.
I do that too, don't worry.
Can I
Get me
now
on the train.
Can I now thank Philip, because we get close to sort of
Yes,
8
thank
o'clock. And thank you so much for that. That was really one of the clearest presentations we've ever had, and certainly one of the most amusing, if you don't mind me saying so, because the elephant was lovely.
Oh, I love the elephant.
I love the elephant. But it will be recorded, and thank you so much, Philip, and you've been really, really helpful. And
No worries.
we much appreciate it.
Yeah, lovely talking to you. You take care, all of you.
Thank you very much indeed.
All the best.
Thank you.
Catch up.
Right, chaps. Next month is another neurologist, this time from the Lister. And everybody who's not, anybody who, even if you're not a member of the West-Herts family, come and join us. You're all very welcome, and tell your friends. And that's fine. So thank you very much for attending. How many did we have today?